Good evening, and welcome to the Armenian Studies lecture series here at Fresno State. We're very happy this evening to have with us Dr. Boris Adjemian, who is the current director of the AGBU Nubar Library in Paris. He is also the editor-in-chief of the bilingual academic journal Études Arméniennes Contemporaines, so Contemporary Armenian Studies, or Modern Armenian Studies journal comes out of there. He received his PhD in 2011. He defended his PhD and was a combined effort between the École des Aptitudes en Sciences Sociales and of the Università degli Studi di Napoli Orientali. So between Italy and France, the two of them, and his thesis was on the Ethiopian community in, the Armenian community in Ethiopia. So tonight, Dr. Adjemian will be presenting us with a short introduction to the Nubar Library, which houses a very important collection of Armenian archives, and I'm sure that will be enlightening. And on the other hand, then he will then move into his recent work on the Armenian community in Ethiopia and how they created a homeland in the diaspora. I'd also like to alert you to two of our upcoming lectures this month and next month. On October 24th, we will, Barlow, you will be presenting, at least in part, a reflection on the trip to Armenia this summer that took place in 2017 this summer. And so we'll have a reflection on how the students enjoyed that trip and what they did. And then on November 14th, we'll have a lecture by Adrian Alexanian on Forced into Genocide, which is based on her father's memoirs of how he survived the Armenian genocide because he was able to bugle. It's a fascinating story. I know a bit about it since I wrote the introduction to the translation to the book. So we're very happy to have her here. It's a crazy story when you actually read it about how just he actually didn't really know how to play the bugle, but he was good at faking it. And he was better than any of the other officers in the camp, and so they allowed him to survive. Nonetheless, this is a very poignant memory of how he survived through the genocide and what happened. So that will be on November 14th, both of those events at 7:30 p.m. In this room. So without any further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Adjemian to lecture to us on the AGBU Nubar Library and on the Armenian community of Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Just speak louder. If not, we'll switch the microphone.
So, and then do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. So, first, thank you, my warm thanks to the Program of Armenian Studies and particularly to Barlow Dermagomedchian for this invitation to Fresno. Of course, speaking in Fresno, for me, it has something very special as a historian interested and working on the issue of the diaspora and of course the Armenian diaspora. And so I know Fresno is a very special place, is one of the hearts of the Armenian diaspora, and for this I'm very, very happy to be here tonight. So, Barlow kindly asked me to speak about two different topics in the same lectures. That is to say, like these shampoos, 2-in-1. It will be a lecture 2-in-1. So I will start with the Nubar Library. So this, I don't know, excuse me, Barlow, just why the internet is not displayed on the screen.
You can do the one on the bottom, remember? Just on the...
shall I close the...
Can? There, just click on this.
Yes,
Oh, that's the PowerPoint.
yes.
Yeah, there it was. Okay, now do the
Okay.
library. There it is.
No.
Oh. Switching, should.
So perhaps I should close.
Yes, close the PowerPoint.
I close the PowerPoint.
There you go. And there it goes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. So, a few pictures about a few data about the Nubar Library. The Nubar Library was founded in 1928. So it is a venerable institution in the Armenian diaspora. It's an old lady with a lot of things to say, to tell, a lot of mysteries too. A lot of unknown information still to be discovered, and also a history, a long history, still to be written, because nobody was patient enough and meticulous enough till now to write it. So, the Nubar Library was founded by Boris Nubar. Boris Nubar, of course, you know, Boris Nubar was the first president of the AGBU, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, which was founded, a philanthropic association, which was founded in Cairo in 1906 by a group of Armenian Egyptians. And he was also the former president of one of the Armenian national delegations, the first one, founded in 1912. So he moved to Paris during the First World War in order to accomplish, in order to work as the head of the Armenian national delegation and to work with the allied governments during the war. And that is why, just after the war, right after the war, the headquarters, the central board of the AGBU moved also from Cairo to Paris. So in 1922, Boris Nubar and a group of Armenian entrepreneurs, called Zarar, they decided to build a new building in the 16th arrondissement district of Paris, not far from Trocadero and from the Tour Eiffel. And they built this building that you can see now on the pictures, and they kept one floor for the AGBU office and for the library. The library was officially opened 6 years later in 1928. And the first director of the library, officially he was not the director, he didn't have the title of director of the library, but he was the true director of the library. I would even say that he was the soul of the library, was Aram Andonian. Aram Andonian, you may have heard a lot about him. Aram Andonian was a former journalist of Istanbul, he was arrested on the 21st of April 1915 with all the Armenian elite, and he was one of those who survived to the deportation, one of those who miraculously survived to the deportation. He was deported, and he went as far as Meskene, not far from Deir Zor, but he managed to escape and to hide, mainly in Aleppo. And since then, and right after the end of the Ottoman domination in Syria in the end of 1918, he started to collect testimonies of survivors of the atrocities of the genocide, and I think we can say that he spent most of his life, or the rest of his life, to collect this kind of documents, of evidences, of testimonies, of course, at the time in the hope to prepare, to make possible future trials of the young Turk leaders, because, of course, many Armenian institutions and the Republic of Armenia and the Armenian National Delegation or the Patriarchate of Istanbul were seeking to document the atrocities in order to sustain their claims for justice, claims for also for reparations, and the like. So it is in this perspective, I think, that the library started also, in this context, that the library also started its activity. That is to say that the library, and I'm quoting Aram Andonian's own words here because he wrote a small text about the founding of the library in 1928, and he explained that the library was a center dedicated to the Armenian studies and Oriental studies. So it was a place of erudition, a place for scholars, but also a place for intellectuals, French and Armenians, to meet and to exchange ideas. And at the time, you have to notice that the French intelligentsia was fully aware of what had happened in Anatolia. And also, like in England, there was a very strong pro-Armenian movement among the French intelligentsia since the end of the 19th century. This is very well known. There are plenty of books written on this topic. So there were these connections, and for example, Arshak Chobanian, the well-known Armenian writer who was in exile, who was living in exile in Paris, was visiting very, very often Aram Andonian in the Nubar Library. They were having coffee together. We have testimonies of this. So it was a place for erudition, a place for scholarship, also a place for politics, because in this place they were talking about the political realities of the Armenian people and the fact that the Armenian people had been destroyed, at least its Ottoman side, and that they had to prepare for asking reparation, for asking justice. So I think this has to be underlined in order to introduce to the collections of the Nubar Library. The Nubar Library is not only a library. I could explain this affirmation, this assertion in different manners. First, it is not only a library, because it is more than a library, because it is really a kind of national heritage for the Armenians. It is national heritage for the French Armenian community. It was one of the pillars, the cultural and intellectual pillars of the French Armenian community during the 1930s, 1940s, with the newspaper, the Oratert, the daily newspaper Harach, and also with the Keradun, the bookshop Samuelian, Ran Samuelian. Unfortunately, Harach and the Samuelian bookshop disappeared, and only the Nubar Library is left now. So it is really a heritage, important heritage for the French Armenian community, but outside of this, it is a heritage for the Armenian diaspora and for the Armenian people at large. And that's why we continue to receive a lot of books and contributions, visits, archives, photos by people from all the diaspora who trying to consider that the library is theirs, is ours. It has something collective. So it is the AGBU Nubar Library, because the AGBU sustains the existence of the library, and this is essential, this is crucial. But in the meantime, we have to be aware of the fact that for the Armenian people, this library has a dimension which is larger than the question of a private ownership by an association or by a foundation. It is really a kind of askain jalan kutun. It is a national good. So, also, it is not only a library, it is more than a library, because there are not only books in the library. In the library you find books. In the Nubar Library you find a lot of books, in a limited space, by the way. Considering the number of books, printed books, we have approximately 43,000 books, a bit more, 43,000 books, which is not so impressive in terms of numbers, but in the meantime, for a diasporic institution, it is quite important. And there are not so many other libraries in the diaspora, in the Armenian diaspora, which have so many books. There are 3 other libraries. We can say, principally, there is the Meritarist Library in Venice, Venedig, the Meritarist Library in Vienna, Austria, and also the library of the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem. All these libraries have their own singularities, their own specificities in terms of collection. I would say that if I compare with the other libraries that I had mentioned now, the specificities of the Nubar Library regarding the collection, it is that these collections are rather pertaining to the modern and contemporary periods, with a lot of documentation regarding the period of the war, the period of the genocide, the consequences of the genocide, and the growth of an Armenian larger diaspora in the 20th century. There is another difference, of course. As you can imagine, since, as you can see, I am not an ecclesiastic, and the Meritarist libraries in Vienna and Venedig, and also the Jerusalem Library, are run by ecclesiastic institutions. So this is not a small difference. In the current situation, I think that the more open of these 4 institutions is the Nubar Library. I mean, we grant facilities, we allow anyone to come to the library on a regular basis, and I know by experience, for example, that the access to the archives in Jerusalem, for example, is still problematic. It is still very, very limited, even to professional researchers. It is not the case in Paris, where everybody can come freely to the library. I was saying also that the library, the Nubar Library, is not only a library, because it has not only printed books, but also it has archives. And these archives are, by essence, they are unique. So the archives can be divided in 4 main groups. The Andonian collection. So the Andonian collection are the materials that he collected for the history of the deportations and the massacres. And these materials are divided by geographically, according to the origin of the survivors, of the deportees. And for example, so we put on the website of the library some samples of this collection of archives, and I just want to show you a sample with the file of the massacres in their zone. But I realized that it is not working. Okay, so it doesn't matter. Ah, no, it's not working. It is capricious. Okay. I had I have the experience of technical problems during conferences. It is quasi-systematic. So I always have my computer with me, and I have also a local version of this website. I could display the archives now, but it will take us time, so I don't want. Perhaps later. So these are handwritten documents with information, very precise information about the survivors, the experience they had in the camps, especially in Syria and in Mesopotamia. And this documentation was crucial for historian Raymond Kevorkian in the 1990s and early 2000s to write his major books and studies about what he called, for the first time in the historiography, the second phase of the genocide. That is to say, for the year 1916, because as you know, the genocide was not only 1915, it was also largely the year 1916. And these studies by Raymond Kevorkian, who is, by the way, my predecessor in the library. He was the former director of the library. He's a historian too. These archives helped him to document a side of the genocide which was very less known than the early stages of the genocide, that is to say the deportation itself and the massacres in eastern Anatolia. To go quickly, we have also sections of the archives of the Patriarchate of Istanbul. These are correspondences of the Patriarchate with the provinces in the 19th century, from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. In this archive of the Patriarchate of Istanbul, there are also files on the massacres of 1894-1896, the Hamidian massacres, the so-called Hamidian massacres. And there is also a very important piece with the census realized in 1913-1914 by the Armenian Patriarchate, census of the Ottoman Armenian population, by which the Patriarchate estimated that the Armenian population of the empire amounted to 1.9 million, which was almost twice the official Ottoman estimation, 1.1 million at the same time. Also this statistic was incomplete because there were the area of Van was not included in the statistic, and also the Catholic Armenian and Protestant Armenian were not included in the statistic. So we know, thanks to this source, that there were more than 2 million Armenians, largely more than 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the eve of the genocide. And this source, the original document, is in the Nubar Library today. So this source, how did they come to the library? It is because in 1922, when the Kemalists occupied Istanbul, the Patriarchate, the Armenian Patriarchate, fearing for the documentation he had succeeded to collect just after the war in order to document the atrocities committed by the Young Turks, he preferred to send all this documentation away, so he sent it to Manchester, England, where there was a wealthy community of Armenian merchants, and from there the Archbishop Grigoris Balakian, who was designated to create a diocese in Marseille, in the south of France, he came to France with this documentation, and from Marseille they were sent to Paris, where they remained. Later on, in 1938, a section of this documentation was sent to Jerusalem to the request of the former Armenian Patriarch of Istanbul, Zaven Yiryayan, and they remained there. So it is the section of the archive which is pertaining to the years of the war itself and the genocide. But for the previous part of the archive, they remain in Paris. We also have here the archives of the Armenian National Delegation, at least part of its archives, The remaining part was sent to Yerevan, I think in the 1980s, early 1980s. We have only a microfilm of this missing part. And to complete this panorama, we have also the archives of the AGBU, which are very important to study the consequences of the genocide and all the activities developed by the AGBU in the interwar period to sustain the life of the survivors, creating schools and orphanages in the Middle East and in the diaspora. So, I don't want to be too long on this presentation of the library. You have to know that we also have an important collection of periodicals, that is to say, newspapers, of course, Armenian newspapers. The majority of them were published in the Ottoman Empire, or in the Republican Turkey, or in the diaspora. Europe, Greece, Middle East, Egypt, America, South America, and a smaller part was published in Yerevan and Tiflis. I want to stress that some of the periodicals that we have can't be found elsewhere easily. For example, you won't find all these periodicals in Yerevan, where, of course, there are a lot of documentation too, but some of their documentations are incomplete, especially regarding the Western Armenian world, and sometimes we have sources that they don't have, even in the National Library of Armenia. And so you might find on the website lists of the archives, lists of the periodicals that we have, and I want to say to finish that also the library is not only a library, because it is also a resource center, a documentation center for people coming to the library because they want to find information about their ancestors' life. So, people like you and me, professional researchers, historians, musicologists, art historians, anthropologists, political scientists, and the like, who come to study our collections. Also, a lot of PhD candidates are coming to the library. In the past 3 or 4 years, I'm sure I have seen at least 100 PhD candidates coming to the library or writing, asking for documentation to the library. People from, it has a really international audience, the library now. It is not anymore a French Armenian library, it is an international diaspora library. We have people coming from Australia, people coming from Argentina, Uruguay, all Europe, of course, Armenia, of course, Lebanon, and more people coming from Turkey, or more specifically, PhD candidates, Turkish PhD candidates, who are writing their PhD in an American or European university, where they can more freely develop topics regarding the Armenian past of the Ottoman Empire and of the modern Turkey. And so we see with pleasure some of these PhD candidates, young scholars coming to us, learning Armenian and trying to find out new facts, new information in Armenian sources which are very important not only for Armenian history, but also for Ottoman history. And there are a lot of sources, for example, the newspapers, that might be very, very useful to Ottomanists in order to study and to deepen our knowledge of the social and cultural history of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, there is a language barrier, but slowly the barriers are opening, and there are not only language barriers, as you know, there are also political barriers, but I can say that the things are getting better now. We are not only a library, because we are also organizing conferences, sometimes big conferences. We co-organized a conference in Jerusalem 3 years ago. We are now publishing the proceedings of this conference. Small conferences, lectures, we also contributed to the organization of exhibition. For example, Armenia 1915, and I'm praying that it will work. Yes, it worked. So it was I think the biggest exhibition organized on the Armenian genocide in Europe, ever organized in Europe on this thematic. It was in 2015, and it was in a very important place in Paris. It was in the City Hall of Paris, organized, funded by the municipality of Paris to the request of the mayor of Paris. So also it tells a lot about the status now of the recognition of the genocide in France, which is really advanced in every field of the public space and in the politics and in the media too. And so we decided after this exhibition to make its life longer by providing the same exhibition but online this time. So in a very simple way, with a lot of documents, photos, videos, maps, and an information which is written or rewritten in order to be read by any teacher in secondary schools or students. It is really Maceli,
Approachable. Something that's approachable, something that
approachable,
people can
yeah,
use.
approachable. This is the idea. So, for example, so you are of course invited to navigate on the website. Every image can be enlarged, of course, and I want to show you this. It was a map which was displayed for the first time in Paris City Hall. And the idea was to provide a pedagogical tool for the public, a public which doesn't know always the history of the genocide. And this map, for example, was displaying the roads of the deportations, the places of massacres in eastern Anatolia in the first phase of the genocide. Also, the camps of Syria, the remote camps of Palestine, for example, and so I don't know how to cut the duduk here, but just to give an illustration of the kind of work that we are doing with this library, around this library, because the library is not only a library again, but also a resource center, that is to say, a place where people who are interested by Armenia or the Armenian genocide or the Armenian world, French people, foreign people, will come, be they scholars, students, journalists, artists, filmmakers, or simple people like you and me who are looking for information. So, and to finish, but in one word, I want to say also that we have a lot of publications, and we have this journal that Sergio Laporta evoked in his introduction, but I don't want to lose time with this, but all these publications can be read online. It is freely accessible. This journal, Études Arméniennes Contemporaines, is in open access, and it is, I have to say, sadly, the only, currently the only academic journal dedicated to the field of Armenian studies, which is edited electronically and which is open to any reader in open access online. So feel free to visit and to read the journal. It is bilingual in English and in French. So, Barlow,
On the left it says Fresno. That's the one you want.
Oh yeah, thank you. You are very efficient. So, yesterday evening I was thinking, how can I shift from the library to Ethiopia? It's not so difficult. It's not so difficult. Last year, an evening, I was alone in the library, and you know, the librarian is always terrified by the amount of dust which he finds in the library, and the things that have been put in the right place and that are not in the right place, this kind of works. And I was alone in the library, it was an evening, and so I displaced this perhaps 10, 20 files, which were not in the right order, obviously, and in the bottom, on the last layer, I found an album of photographies, 2 albums of photographies, actually, and I realized these photographies were all connected to Ethiopia. And I realized that these photographies were made by the photographer Hrant. You can see his name written in Amharic here. Photo Hrant. Hrant was obviously an Armenian photographer who established his studio in Addis Ababa in the 1920s. He was one of the first to open a photographic studio in Addis Ababa, and this is strongly linked to the important role played by Armenian photographers, Armenians in the development of the photography, of the art of photography in Ethiopia and at large, more broadly in the Middle East. So in this, I was very happy, of course, because I was working on the Ethio-Armenian history for a long time, nearly 20 years, more than 20 years. And in this album, there was this photography. This is a photography of the community. Sorry, oh no.
Yeah, there you go. Just now use the forward.
Thank you. This is a photography of the community, part of the community, I think in 1925 or 26. And what is very interesting is that they are wearing this portrait, and this portrait is the portrait of the king of Ethiopia, the king of the kings, Nebuchadnezzar. It can be translated roughly by king of the kings, Nebuchadnezzar. But it is not the current king. It is the king who passed away at least 10 or 13 years earlier. Even the date of his death is not really ascertained. It was the emperor Menelik. And they have this portrait of Menelik. They are photographed with the portrait of Menelik. And Menelik is the king, but it is the former king. And it is very interesting for me because I know that there is a strong idea in the Armenian community of Ethiopia that the Armenians have always been the favori, the preferred servants of the Ethiopian kings, and that this preference started in the time of Menelik, that is to say at the end of the 19th century. So it is very interesting to see that even 10 or 15 years after Menelik's death, the community identified herself to the fidelity, to the loyalty to this former king. And this is interesting for me because when I went to Ethiopia, I heard a lot of stories about the strong relationship which existed between the kings and the Armenians, but of course all these stories were told by people who were living now. But with this document, I had an opportunity to see that more than 18 years ago, the same strong idea already existed. And for me, I wanted to introduce the topic of the Armenian in Ethiopia with this photo, because I think what makes the specificity of the Armenian diaspora of the Armenian history in Ethiopia is precisely the way how Armenians settled in the country, settled not physically, but settled mentally, settled ideologically, settled with their sensibility, by considering that they were, from all the foreigners, the closest to the Ethiopian people, and that this closeness was proved, was shown by the strong relationship that they had with the kings. Haile Selassie in the last period, Menelik before him, and other chiefs, queens of this late 19th century and early 20th century. So, a few words about so the Armenian community in Ethiopia started in the end of the 19th century. They started at the end of the 19th century. At the time, Addis Ababa, the capital city, didn't exist, and the first Armenian who settled as a community went to Harar here, which was a Muslim city at the time, a Muslim city, which was not inside the Ethiopian kingdom of Ethiopia. The borders were not the same at the time. This is modern Ethiopia, this is current Ethiopia. And the Armenians who came to Harar in the first phase were coming from Anatolia, of course, but most of them from the area of Arakir. They were Arakirtsi. Or other came from Agen, a lot from Agen. Let's say the vilayet of Harpet. This is the first wave of the community in the late 19th century, but there were very few. I think at the end of Menelik's time, Menelik died in 1913 accordingly. So just 1 year before the First World War. At the end of his reign, I think that there were between 150 and 200 Armenians in the whole Ethiopia, which is almost nothing, obviously, in terms of numbers. 150 to 200 people, including children and women. But at the time, there were very few foreigners in Ethiopia, and the Armenians were considered as the third or fourth community in Ethiopia, with the Greeks, the Indians, and the Arabs, mainly people from Yemen. The other communities, French, Swiss, Italians, Russians, British, were in very, very small numbers compared to Greeks and to Armenians. After the war, after the genocide, there was a second phase of Armenian immigration to Ethiopia, and then there was a shift from the Harpet vilayet to the Aleppo vilayet, and most of the people coming in from the second phase after the genocide came from the area of Aintab, a lot of Aintabtsi. They became the new core, the new heart of the community, the new Goris, and people also from Gilgia, Cilicia. And then in the late 1920s, there were about 1,200 Armenians in Ethiopia, 1,200 Armenians in Ethiopia, and this is the maximum of the community. This is the maximum height of the community. So you realize that the community was so small, but compared to the other communities in the diaspora, but in the meantime, everyone has heard about the Armenian community of Ethiopia, and it is, I think, because the Armenian community of Ethiopia, of course, it has something very exotic. Oh, Ethiopia, it is Africa, or beyond the Sahara, so it is very, very fancy. But in the meantime, this community has had something very special in its relationship with the local powers, in its relationship with the local culture. And that's why, for me, it is really an amazing case study for the Armenian diaspora. And beyond that for the diaspora issue. So, this is un peu de réclame, un peu de propagande for the book that I wrote. It is in French, I'm sorry, and it is entitled La fanfare du Négus. And you can see on the cover of the book, there is this fanfare, this brass band of 40 Armenian boys who were all orphans of the genocide, all coming from the Vaspuragan, the region of Van, and they were sent by the British in 1922 to Jerusalem to the orphanage Araradian, which had been created inside the Armenian convent of Jerusalem. And 2 years later, there were 800 Armenian orphans in this Araradian orphanage. 2 years later, the Ras Teferi, he was the Crown Prince of Ethiopia, Ras Teferi. He's the future Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie. He came to Jerusalem. It was the first time he did a visit outside of Ethiopia. It was a diplomatic journey, a very wide journey in Europe with all the capital cities. Because at the time, Ethiopia, which was one of the only African countries which was not colonized, with Liberia, Ethiopia had just been admitted to the League of the Nations, which was something very special, an African country in the League of the Nations in the colonial era. So he decided to make this journey, this trip in Europe, but his first stop was in Jerusalem, because an Ethiopian prince or king who travels abroad could not avoid a stop in Jerusalem, since the Ethiopian king has to be the defender of the Ethiopian church and has to show as much as he can the importance, the value that he gives to the defense of the Christianity and the Ethiopian church. So he visited Jerusalem, he visited the different religious communities, and he visited the Armenian community of Jerusalem and the convent, the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which was the Patriarch Yerishe Turian at the time. And in the Patriarchate, he found a fanfare, a brass band, which was playing in his honor. So he proposed that this fanfare go to Ethiopia with him when he would come back to Ethiopia, and that they could become the official brass band of the government and the official brass band of himself, the Crown Prince of Ethiopia. And the Patriarch accepted the offer, because at the time also the Patriarch wanted to liberate the monastery of all these orphans. Some of them were sent to Soviet Armenia in a kind of repatriation, hundreds of them. Some of them were sent to Ethiopia, 40 of them, these 40 boys, and they are known in Ethiopia. You can see here it is written in Armenia, the same thing that here. So the royal fanfare, the royal brass band of Takavor Tafari Ethiopia, of the Prince Tafari of Ethiopia. By the way, Tafari, Ras Tafari, Ras is a title, like Rais in Arabic. It's a title for a chief, and Tafari is his first name. The Ethiopian has no family name. His first name is Teferi, the name of his father is Mekonnen. So he is Teferi Mekonnen. But we say Ras Teferi, his title and his first name. And you know that the reggae, in Jamaica, there was a religion of the Rastafarianism, which was centered on the idea that he was the Rastafari, as they say. It comes from the two words, Ras and the name Teferi. It's a deformation of these two words. So the brass band played for a few years for the king, and here it is mentioned in the autobiography of Haile Selassie with this picture. And on the same picture, you can see this man is Kevort Nalbandian. Kevort Nalbandian was the chief of this orchestra. He became the chief of music of the palace, of the Ethiopian palace, and he was asked by Rastafari to write a national anthem for Ethiopia. Because at the time, Ethiopia was trying to develop and to present itself on an equal foot with all the colonial and European powers. But it had no flag, no money, no national anthem. So the flag and the money, national symbols, were created by Menelik at the end of the 19th century to claim that Ethiopia was an independent country, a sovereign country. And his continuator, his successor, Rastafari, continued the same effort, and he created the national anthem. He asked an Armenian to create a national anthem. So the first national anthem of Ethiopia was written by an Armenian, Kevort Nalbandian, and played by 40 Armenian boys. And this national anthem, it is not anecdotic because it was played 50 years, during 50 years, until the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, which, sorry, it works. And the collapse of the Ethiopian monarchy in 1974, this was the national anthem. I think I'm going to speak like this. You hear me? Yes. So the fanfare, this brass band, was very curious in Ethiopia at the time because there was no European music. There were no European instruments. Even the boys were, there were the sonorities, but they were odd for the people. As you can see, the people in the streets looking at the fanfare. These are the funerals of a well-known Armenian of the community, Boris Adjemian. He was a photographer. And the day of his funeral, he was close to the king. He was close to Haile Selassie. The day of his funeral, we are in 1927, the fanfare walked in the front in a cortege. And you can see how the people are impressed in the streets. At the time, there was no European music, so the Armenians played a role, this fanfare played a role in the development of Europeanized music with European instruments. And one of the members of this Armenian fanfare, he was Garabet Akalmazian. He is photographed here a few years later with an Ethiopian fanfare based on the same principle, with Ethiopian children wearing uniforms, military uniforms, and they were even playing Armenian tunes. Yeah, they were playing European tunes, military music. They were playing hymns, anthems when the delegations, foreign delegations were coming, like for the official imperial coronation of Haile Selassie III, becoming Haile Selassie as an emperor in 1930. At the time, the Armenian band was not playing anymore, but there was this band playing. And there was, by the way, the same day, there was an official, Turkish official delegated to the coronation. And this Turkish official had two interpreters with him. And the two interpreters were Armenian. And I knew one of them, he was Avedis Terzian. And he explained me that in this occasion, the Ethiopian band formed by Garabet Akalmazian played Tashnak Tsagan tunes. And the Turkish envoy laughed and said, "Oh, you also came here You also infiltrated this country. Very interesting. And there was other stories like this, but I don't want to be too long on these anecdotes. But it is interesting to see the shift from an Ethiopian Armenian fanfare to an Ethiopian fanfare.
That was in 1913? Or before that?
1930. This is in 1930. Yeah. So these are pictures which were done in Jerusalem before the departure of the fanfare with the Ethiopian queen, the wife of Haile Selassie. She's here. She's, by the way, she's accompanied by her, by a lady who was working with her and who accompanied her in all her travels. And this lady was Mrs. Alexi Yazanjian. She was an Armenian, and her daughter was she and her daughter and her family were very close to the royal palace. Well, this is a photo which was taken in Jerusalem just on the eve of the departure of the orphans to Ethiopia. We are in 1924. Back to the community itself, no, because I started my story in the end of the 19th century and I went to the fanfare in 1924. A lot of people believe that because everything has been forgotten of this history, so a lot of people only remember the story of the 40 orphans, which were known in Ethiopia as the Arbale Judge. Arbale Judge, it means the 40 kids. The 40 kids. And they say that these 40 kids had been adopted by the emperor, which was not true, by the way. I can elaborate on this later on. But they believe sometimes that the 40 orphans were the first Armenians to come to Ethiopia. It is not true. There was an Armenian community when the boys came. This Armenian community started to develop in the 19th century as a community, but there were Armenians in Ethiopia much before, in much earlier period. From the 16th century, 17th century, we have written evidences of the presence of Armenian merchants or ecclesiastics in Ethiopia. And at the end of the 19th century, we know that there were Armenians serving as craftsmen in the royal palace, in the court of Menelik, for example, and even the court of his predecessor, Johannes, Emperor Johannes. One of them was Dikran Ebeyan. Dikran Ebeyan was Vosgerich, a jeweler, a goldsmith, but he was not only making crafts. I mean, his work was beyond that. He was working with gold. Gold is not a normal material. Gold is a very specific material, and he was making the ornaments of the palace, the ornaments of the royal power, and he was making the crowns. He was making the crowns. So it is very interesting to see that in this period of 30 years, Ethiopian kings trusted the making of Ethiopian national symbols, symbols of powers, to foreigners, but not any kind of foreigners, to Armenians, not the other foreigners. Very interesting. The music was part of this mise en scène of the imperial power in 1924. It was trusted to Armenians. 30 years earlier, it was the same for the goldsmith. He was making the crown. There is the story of an Italian envoy, an Italian emissary to Menelik in 1895. He says, he writes, Menelik has 2 crowns in gold. One has been offered by the Italian government as a gift in testimony of our friendship to Ethiopia. You know that 1 year later we were at war. The second one has been made by his personal goldsmith, an Armenian called Tigran. Strangely enough, the King Menelik shows that he doesn't want to like the Italian crown,
he only wants to wear the Armenian crown. Although the Italian crown is better, it is more beautiful, it is finer. So he doesn't understand the Italian envoy at the time. But if you understand the Ethiopian political context of the time, you understand that an Ethiopian king, for him, it was really difficult to put on his head a crown which had been offered by a foreign power, especially a foreign power which was trying to colonize Eastern Africa. So his duty, his mission was to protect the church, the Ethiopian church, and to protect the independence of Ethiopia. So to have the crown of Tikran was not making any problem. First, because Tikran was not coming from a colonial power. Second, because Tikran was Armenian. And here there is also a strong importance of the connection between the Armenian church and the Ethiopian church. And then we are coming back to Jerusalem. So you see, I'm making circles in order to try to explain you this very peculiar relationship that existed between Armenians and Ethiopians at the time. So, I will come back to this later. So, at the time of Tikran, there were other people like Boris Adjemian, nicknamed Hayrik by the Armenians, and by like Sarkis Terzian, nicknamed Terlik Sarkis, Sarkis the Great by the Ethiopians. It is in Amharic. Terlik means great. Terlik Sarkis is considered as a hero in the Ethio-Armenian community, as a hero, and with a lot of achievements. All of them, all of the three, are considered as close friends of Menelik, even if you won't see their names in written European sources at the time, even in Ethiopian sources, you won't see their name. Very often, they are silenced. But in the memories, they occupy a very strong, a very large place in the memory of this proximity between the Armenians and the Armenian people at large and the Ethiopian kings. So, how to explain that Armenians were so prominent in the imperial court at the time? I think we have to take into consideration what the French historian Fernand Braudel called longue durée, the history in the long times, if you want, not only the short period. If you consider the link between the Ethiopian church and the Armenian church, it is very revealing. Ethiopian and Armenian ecclesiastics had close relationship in Jerusalem for centuries. We know that between the 18th century and the 19th century, even the Armenian Patriarchate was feeding the Armenian monks every day by providing them soup and bread, because they had no assistance from their own country and they were living in poverty. And in a certain way, this situation continued in the 20th century also in certain periods. For example, after the Ethiopian Revolution, which was a communist revolution. If you look at older testimonies, you realize that for Ethiopian kings of the past times, Armenians occupied a special place in their perception of the foreign world. In the 16th century, for example, Ethiopia started to increase its relations with European powers. The aim of Ethiopian kings at the time was to fight against Muslims in Eastern Africa, which were threatening the Ethiopian kingdom, the Christian Ethiopian kingdom. So there was an alliance with the king of Portugal. But the king of Portugal not only sent soldiers and fire weapons, but also sent missionaries. And these missionaries, Jesuits, they tried to re-Christianize, re-baptize the Ethiopians, considering that they could not be good Christians since they were not Catholic Roman Catholics. So it is a complicated history and it is quite long because some Ethiopians accepted this. Even a king, King Susenyos, in the early 17th century, was rebaptized as a Catholic, but he was, by doing so, he provoked a kind of civil war, of internal war, and finally he was forced to abdicate, to leave the throne to his son, Fasilidas Basil. And the first act of Fasilidas in 1632 was to expel all the Catholics of the country. And for 150 years, quite a long period of time, Catholic and even Protestants, European, and what the Ethiopian called Farange, it means Frank, it comes from the word Frank. So all this word is used to designate the European, the Catholics, the white people, and even the uses which are not Ethiopian. For example, to smoke in the 16th century, it was called a Farange habit to smoke, tobacco. They expelled the Europeans, and the poor Jesuits who tried to come back in Ethiopia, when they were discovered, they were killed in the 16th century and in the, no, not 16th, 17th century and in the 18th century. In the same period, Armenians continued to travel in Ethiopia quite freely, be they ecclesiastics or merchants. Even some merchants were ambassadors for Ethiopian kings. For example, Hoja Murat, he served between 1640 and 1700. He served 3 different Ethiopian emperors, and he was sent as far as India and Indonesia as an ambassador. There are many examples like this one. And later on, in the 19th century, the relations between the Europeans and the Ethiopians restarted, but there was a crisis in the 1860s when the Ethiopian king, Theodore, arrested and imprisoned a few European citizens, including the British consul of the coastal town of Massawa on the Red Sea. And this was a serious diplomatic crisis between the United Kingdom and Ethiopia. And the United Kingdom started to organize a military force to go in Ethiopia and by force to liberate the European hostages. But in the meantime, the British tried to organize a kind of mediation, and they kindly asked the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem, to send mediators to Ethiopia to intercede in favor of the liberation of the European hostages. So the Armenians, they sent 2 priests. One of them was Timotheos Sabrechian. He wrote a long account of his travel in Ethiopia. It is published in Armenian, but also in French, and even there is a 3rd edition in German. And he explains that when they arrived in Ethiopia, it was in 1866, they were immediately robbed and imprisoned by Ethiopian rebels of the north of the country, so that they never succeeded to accomplish their mission and to visit the Ethiopian king Theodorus in his fortress. So it was a real fiasco. They were robbed, kidnapped, arrested, and he complains every day, oh, the Ethiopians are bad, they don't feed us enough, they robbed all that we have, and the like. And one day, the Ethiopian chief who detained them as prisoners sent to them Ethiopian priests in order to interrogate them about their faith. And the Ethiopian priests conclude that they are not spies, they are not Farange, they are true Orthodox co-religionists, they are Armenians. So after this interrogatory, their status changed completely. So they receive a lot of honors. Even one of them is asked to stay in Ethiopia to become the new chief of the Ethiopian church, a privilege that he prefers to refuse because he was in a hurry to leave Ethiopia. His experience in Ethiopia was a bit tough, so he wanted to leave the country. So there are many, I could tell a lot of stories like this to underline the importance of the religious factors in the making of a proximity between the Ethiopian kings and this Armenian population who immigrated later on in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Because, of course, the Armenian immigrants were not aware of all these relations of the past. But I think that the Ethiopian kings, the Ethiopian church, they were aware. In their mind, Armenians were somewhere between the national and the foreign. They were not Faranj. They were not called Faranj in Ethiopia. All the Europeans, all the white people were Faranj, but the Armenians were not called Faranj. They were not considered really as foreigners, and that's why they were so used by the power, the royal power, in the making of national symbols, which can seem a bit surprising, but in fact there is an explanation for this. So I already spoke a lot, and I want to arrive to a conclusion, so I will try to shorten my speech now. What remained of all this history? History of the idea of a proximity, history of a settlement of a population who claims to be the closest to the Ethiopian people. What remained, I think, is in the memories, and this, to study this, you have to make oral inquiries, to consider oral sources, because this history is not written in books, is not written in official archives. You won't find more than a footnote or a single line on these issues. Armenians are not in books in Ethiopia. Never, or very, very seldom. But if you consider oral sources, photographies that are kept in the Armenian families in Addis Ababa or in the diaspora, because most of them left the country after the Ethiopian Revolution. Some of them are in California, some of them in Montreal, some of them in Australia, others in Europe. Then, in this kind of sources, you can realize that the leitmotif of the friendship of the Ethiopian kings for their loyal Armenian servants is a central issue in the memories. It is the red, not the red, we say le fil rouge in French, of a kind of ideology of the memory of the Ethio-Armenian community. And this idea is centered on the life of certain heroes, founding heroes, like the ones I showed you earlier, like Sarkis, Tulvik Sarkis the Great Persian. I very well knew his son, Avedis, who was born in 1904 in Harar and who died in Addis Ababa in 2000. He was the former president of the community, and he was the one who all the Ethio-Armenians considered as the most knowledgeable man in Ethiopia regarding the Armenian history. By the way, he was also considered as a very knowledgeable man by Ethiopian people, considering regarding the Ethiopian history of the 20th century and 19th century, because he was a master in the Amharic language. He was himself an interpreter of the US Embassy during years, and he had even translated official treaties between Great Britain and the Ethiopian government. So he was considered as an authority in the language, in the Ethiopian language, but also in Ethiopian history. And he really strongly stressed that the this relationship that his father and his fellow men had created with the kings was central. And this friendship was illustrated by photographies that were not published, that were kept in the families. For example, this one was given to me by Boris Adjemian. It is a photography showing the founding of the cathedral of Addis Ababa in 1905. And on this photography, you see Menelik, the king, easily recognizable to his hat. And you see under the umbrella of ceremony the Abuna Mateos, who was the chief of the Ethiopian church. And just behind the Abuna Mateos and the king, who are putting the first stone of the cathedral, there is, making a triangle with them, there is this guy. This guy is Adjemian. This guy is the father of Boris. For Boris Adjemian, this photo was remarkable because it was showing the proximity of his father with the king in an important moment. And the photograph is powerful for him because it says something that you will never find in written sources, in official sources. The same kind of stories with Grigorios Borosian, a small man coming from the area of Bartizak. He was a small craftsman in Turkey. He became one of the main furnishers, providers of the Gubbi, the Ethiopian palace in the time of Menelik, until the time of Haile Selassie. And he is then photographed with the king, Menelik, and it looks like as if Menelik was looking at him. It's strange, this photo. It is for the founding of the Menelik Hospital in 1908. And Grigorios was a strong man, but with a great posterity. He had 10 children. 10 children with an Ethiopian woman, an Ethiopian lady of the Ethiopian aristocracy. So himself, he entered the Ethiopian aristocracy, and his children were members of the Ethiopian aristocracy. And I want to show you this photo of two of the sons of Grigorios, Arasi and Hachi and Arasi, and their godfather. And their godfather is the Jats Pasha. The Jats Pasha is one of the most powerful political personages of the early 20th century, of the time of Menelik. He was really someone very, very powerful, very famous at the time. And there were many Armenian boys and girls who had Ethiopian godfathers or godmothers also in the Ethiopian aristocracy. And in the palace, the empress, many times the empress, the Ethiopian, the wife of Haile Selassie, was godmother of Armenian children. Oh, there is also this document, which is an exceptional document written in Armenian. In this document, it is about Tırlık Sarkis, about Sarkis the Great. He says, Menelik, it is signed by Menelik with the seal of Menelik, of the emperor. He says that he, Menelik, he wants to reward his servant, Sarkis Terzian, coming from Armenia in the town of Arakir, age 39, middle height, with curly hair and the like, and who served my kingdom of Ethiopia for a long time, and now he is considered as an Abyssinian. He should be considered as an Abyssinian. And I gave him this passport. This is a passport, in order to show that he's an Ethiopian citizen and to facilitate his travels, because Sarkis was sent many times abroad to make purchase for Menelik. So for Boris Adjemian, this paper, the son of Sarkis, this paper was something very exceptional, of course, because of the text. The text is exceptional, but also because of the signature, because Menelik, as an Ethiopian emperor, never signed. It is known by all the Ethiopian historians that the emperor should never sign an official document. Only the seal, the official seal. But here we can read in Amharinia something which looks like Menelik. But I tried to authentify this document, and one day I put it under the eyes of an Ethiopian historian whom I knew well, and he told me it is impossible that Menelik signed this paper. I don't read Menelik, I don't believe it is Menelik. And myself, in the same time, I had found already 2 other documents published in German books of the early 20th century, saying this is an autograph signature of Menelik, and it is quite the same signature. You can see, quite the same. There is the 3rd one. It is quite the same. And each time it is written, it is a signature of Menelik. So we don't know if it is a true signature or if there are 3 wrong signatures of Menelik. But it doesn't matter. What is interesting is that for the son of Avedis the Great, the son of Cyrus the Great, of Avedis, this signature was the evidence, the major evidence of the proximity, the friendship of Menelik, exceptional friendship. He signs the document. A king never should do it. For Sarkis, because Sarkis was an exceptional servant, exceptionally loyal to him, and beside this, there was the idea really that it is Sarkis, but it is not only Sarkis. It is the friendship of the Ethiopian king, the protection of the Ethiopian king for the Armenian people. And this is on this note that I wanted to conclude. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm open, of course, to discussion and questions.